Great. Well, welcome, greetings everyone, and welcome to Decolonizing Justice. I'm Liz Keith. I'm the program director with Pro Bononet, and my preferred pronouns are she and hers. We are so glad to have all of you with us today for the final day in this gathering centered on the theme Bringing Justice Home. Those who participated in the keynote sessions earlier this week know we have endeavored to incorporate a language justice lens into this gathering by offering simultaneous Spanish interpretation for several sessions, including our discussion this morning. And before we begin that discussion, we would like to invite Cooperativa Brújulas, our wonderful interpreters and collaborators, to take a few moments to share more about their work, as well as the interpretation logistics for those who prefer to participate in Spanish. So welcome, Mio.
Thank you, Liz. Antes de la introducción, queremos asegurar que si necesita función de interpretación que esté activada, así que por favor puede activarla en la parte de abajo de su pantalla. Es un botón que en forma de globo, le dan clic ahí y va a aparecer el idioma español. Ahora voy a continuar en inglés. Before the introduction, we want to make sure that your interpretation function is working. So please activate it now, and that would be by clicking at the bottom of your screen. It's a globe. You click on it and click on the language. And I'm going to continue in Spanish. Así que hola a todos. Es un honor estar con ustedes ya el último día. Mi nombre es Millo Huertas Hernández. Mi pronombre es ella. Estoy aquí con mi colega Bruje Fuego. Sus pronombres son ella, él y belleza. Aquí hoy desde tierra arcaica, saladoide, hueca, ostiones y taína, Boriquén, Puerto Rico. Estamos aquí como parte de Cooperativa Brújulas, trabajando con el marco de justicia del lenguaje y sanación. Y la misma es el derecho humano para interrumpir y asegurar que ningún idioma es dominante sobre otro idioma y que cada persona tiene el derecho de hablar, escuchar y que se le entienda en el lenguaje con que fluye mejor desde su corazón. En Cooperativa Brújulas reconocemos que el lenguaje en Puerto Rico y a lo largo del mundo ha sido utilizado como herramienta para excluir, controlar, deshumanizar y colonizar. Por lo tanto, trabajamos la justicia del lenguaje como una práctica, idea política y visión crucial para descolonizar, sanar y relacionarnos de formas más profundas y crear accesibilidad de poder y participación justa y de liberación. Honramos la naturaleza y nuestros ancestres, y como parte de esto vamos a estar compartiendo recordatorios utilizando las direcciones y los elementos. Y comenzamos con el este. El elemento es el viento o el aire. El recordatorio es respire y mantenga su ritmo y pausas al hablar. Luego nos movemos al sur. El elemento es el agua. Cooperativa Brújulas usa lenguaje inclusivo porque reconocemos la diversidad y fluidez de géneros en nuestras comunidades. Entonces nos movemos al oeste. El elemento es la tierra. El recordatorio es mantenga su voz cerca de su micrófono. Por último, nos movemos al norte. El elemento es el fuego. El recordatorio es que hable con el lenguaje desde su corazón. De nuevo, en Cooperativa Brújulas estamos muy emocionadas y honradas de estar aquí con ustedes. Así que, por favor, si tiene algún problema, no sufra en silencio. Déjenos saber a través del chat en privado, a través de mi intérprete Millo o Language and Healing Justice o intérprete Bruje Fuego. Muchas gracias y que disfruten. Se la paso a Liz. I'll pass it back to Liz.
Okay, thank you so much, Mio and Bruje, for your collaboration on this event this week. So welcome back, everyone, and we are so delighted to have you with us today, and also extend a warm welcome to those joining for the first time. This event throughout this week has been designed through a collaborative steering committee that includes myself and 3 incredible advocates and leaders in community-centered justice, including Ariadna Aubert, Nicole Nelson, and Matthew Burnett, as well as more than 30 organizations that have volunteered their time and expertise to these conversations, including the extraordinary leaders we'll have the opportunity to hear from in our opening conversation today, Envisioning Just Futures. A few logistic reminders. If you need help at any point for interpretation or accessibility logistics, please contact Jenny, our event facilitator, at the information at the address shown here. And please do share your observations, questions, feedback through the chat and QA boxes in Zoom, and use the event Slack space to connect with one another and continue the conversations that we're having here this week. So I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Ariadna Godreau Aubert, the founder and executive director of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, to introduce our opening session this morning.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for showing up today. As Liz was saying, my name is Ariadna, and I'm deeply, deeply honored and grateful for this panel. I also wanted to say thank you to Pro Bono Net, to OSF, to Alaska LSC, and to everyone that has kept coming back to all of the sessions for 5 days. Today, I have the opportunity of being the facilitator of a panel that's called Envisioning a Just Future for All, Nurturing and Sustaining Justice Movements. And I share this space with 3 other women, social justice warriors, people who I admire a lot, who put their intentions, efforts, legal expertise, and bodies on the line to decolonize justice. And by decolonizing justice, I mean that they fight against systemic racism, they fight against colonialism, they fight against the occupation of lands and peoples, against the prison industrial complex, against state-sanctioned repression, against the oppression of law. And they practice many diverse things, including radical maternities. And that's something that I wanted also to mention in this space. And they do this with knowledge, they do this with rage, they do this with strategy, and they do this with gusto. So with that, I'm honored to introduce Meena Jagannath, Director of the Global Program for the Movement Law Lab and co-founder of the Community Justice Project. Natasha Lycia Bannan, Senior Counsel and former President of the National Lawyers Guild, and currently at Latino Justice Puerto Rico Legal Defense and Education Fund. And Marbre Stahly-Butts, Executive Director from Law for Black Lives. Thank you all for being here today. So we decided, and I'm going to be sharing some bios using the chat. We decided a different and maybe a more intimate format for this hour discussion. The task that we have is ambitious. We are creating a space to speak about expectations, the future, nurturing and sustaining the work that we do every single day. So the format is going to be a fishbowl. We're going to be having a real-time conversation that maybe we have had fragmented before, but we're going to try to tie it down to an hour and to incorporate the comments, the suggestions, the recommendations, the reactions that all of you have here, all of the participants may have along the way. And when we're having a conversation about sustaining just movements, sustaining future social justice work, it is important to challenge definitions in order to move forwards. So we have heard here a lot about the concept or the framework, the legal empowerment framework of knowing, using, shaping, transforming the law. And I think that it would be amazing to start by discussing in our own words, based on our experiences, what is legal empowerment about? And what is the relationship between legal empowerment and the need to decolonize justice? So I'm gonna ask Mina to please start to save us from the awkwardness from jumpstarting a conversation and take it from there.
First of all, thank you all so much for inviting us and for allowing me to share this virtual stage with women I respect and love so much. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from Seminole and Tocobaga lands in Tampa, Florida. So first, actually, before getting to legal empowerment, I was thinking about this term, decolonizing justice. And it's interesting because I think it seems to imply that justice is the outcome when law is applied to a problem, or in other words, that justice is defined as the output of a legal system, which in itself could seem colonial, because the law can neither define nor produce justice, the law alone. So for me, when I think about the charge before us as instead of saying decolonizing justice, I kind of think about it as decolonizing the law, because if justice could be comprehended and defined without reference or without exclusive reference, let's say, to the law or legal institutions, then perhaps we'd already be on our way to decolonizing conceptions of justice by grabbing it back from the institutions that have been imposed by and shaped by colonialism. So, so that's just about decolonizing justice. But on legal empowerment, I think it's important to, while I think it's important to know or understand the ways in which law impacts our lives, and know on one hand how to wield the law in service of community or movement objectives, and on the other hand wrest power away from the entities that are complicit in creating and maintaining systems of oppression, I think at the same time, especially given the magnitude of the problems that we have before us, we have to be careful not to overemphasize or overstate the potential of the law to produce liberatory outcomes for people. In a lot of places, the law and legal institutions have been shaped in the fashion of Western colonial powers, where notions of justice and how to achieve justice are quite different from customary notions of justice. And so I think in order for community struggles and movements to not be flattened or blunted by, the rigidity of formal legal systems, or actually, using the legal system as a place through which to, sort of reclaim our rights or the resources that we deserve, our self-determination. I think it's important to cultivate and maintain other complementary levers of power that help with this process of transforming and decolonizing the law, like organizing, leveraging the media and communications, cultural work, and other things. And so I'll just conclude this point by saying that, I think this is why when we teach movement lawyering at Movement Law Lab, Law for Black Lives, and other institutions, I think we're careful to, one, interrogate power and the law's relationship to power, and two, really drive home the point that law is but one tool for achieving social change. So to answer your question, legal empowerment is important, but it's just one piece of the process for social change.
Natasha.
Yeah, I think that those are such excellent points that Mina made. And, when I was reflecting on this question, I was thinking about, well, what, when we talk about the decolonization framework, and how it presumes that there was a colonial conquest to begin with, right? And what we know about the law is that it, in fact, I look like I'm in the shadows here, is that there's like all natural lighting. There we go.
It's on point.
It's not even staged. And I think when I think about the law, what we know about it is that it's ultimately the mechanism and system that sustains and preserves capitalism, empire, our wealth, power, and privilege, which are the tools of colonialism. They are the tools of colonial conquest. So what does it mean to decolonize the very mechanisms and systems that have made such legacies of oppression viable and sustainable and legitimized and sanitized overall, which really fundamentally requires kind of an understanding of what decolonial processes are about, that center around the principle of self-determination. And what does self-determination look like in rethinking, reimagining a legal system, right? It really means moving beyond a reformist approach, like moving much more, even perhaps beyond abolitionists, to really, what is it that we need? Not based on what we've been given or what's been imposed on us, but what do we need? And both in terms of justice and the legal mechanisms that allow for that justice to be sought. And I think that's like a radically different, kind of imagination process about what we need in order to be able to continue to live and thrive and coexist in communities where that has not been prioritized. It's been the opposite, right? There have been the politics of death that have been imposed. And, I think it's like it's first kind of an unraveling of what we understand the law to be, delegitimizing it, starting from the profession, because the profession often is really complicit in like our own kind of self-aggrandizing behavior and sense of self-importance. And so understanding that we're participating in mechanisms that are inherently colonial, and I don't just mean in the imperialistic sense. I mean, communities all throughout the United States have been colonized or neo-colonial and operate that way. We've been stripped of power, stripped of processes of self-determination. When they struggle for those processes, then they're criminalized. The very act of seeking to move outside of the law, which has perpetuated their oppression to places where we often win, like the streets, have resulted in further kind of colonial treatment. And so, it's a interesting and collective, and collective inherently exercise for us to engage in around what does it mean to decolonize the tool of the oppressor, in a sense, and particularly from those that participate in it, and to understand the perpetuation of our legal system as it exists, not as some model to be upheld and lifted up. And I don't just mean the United States model, I mean generally, even the mechanisms that we tend to highlight, like international law or human rights, that still have capitalist elements to it, individualist elements that don't contemplate collective liberation the same way. All of that is for us to begin to really think about, well, what does self-determination guarantee us? What does that look like? And how is that linked directly to a just outcome? And defining justice based on that. And that's obviously an exercise that more than lawyers need to be engaged in, but that where I think we play a really critical role in deconstructing the facade that requires us to hold it up, to be complicit in it.
And Marbre, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is so juicy, y'all. So first of all, I want to just also extend the gratitude. It's a real pleasure to be in this space and to be in this conversation with folks who I just regard as brilliant and visionary. So thank you for the opportunity. I think I have a lot of amens, I think, to say. I think one thing that it feels important to name, at least for me, is that I think for some reason, the Tina Turner song, like "What's Love Got to Do with It," is in my head. Of the kind of what does law have to do with justice is a real question, I think, for our people. That over and over again, the law, and this has been said, but has been used as a tool to legitimize oppression, to legitimize genocide, to legitimize slavery, that the law in and of itself is just an articulation of power, of the status quo. And I think the language of sanitization and legitimization are so important, that the law is really meant to take what are horrific realities and to make them seem more palpable, to sanitize them for those who have power. And so the colonial mission, and has always been about using the law as a construct to construct social relationships of hierarchy and then to justify and legitimize them. And so I agree. I think this conversation around like, what is the place of the law? And I think often of Audre Lorde's kind of like, how do you dismantle the master's house without the master's tools? And that doesn't mean that the law isn't one of the tools, but it certainly can't be the only tool, that we are destined to recreate the same structures if we rely on the exact same toolbox. And so I think this is a really important conversation. And I think, in fact, in the work that we do with movement, we attempt to decenter the law as much as possible. The law is meant to create more space for folks to imagine what kinds of structures, what kinds of relationships actually construct justice. And the law in and of itself gives very few answers towards those ends, but can often be used as a defensive tool to create more space, especially in moments of a kind of a violent authoritarian state, that it allows us sometimes some shelter to actually allow the boardwalk of imagining something different to happen in real ways. And so So I'm excited about this kind of decolonization conversation. And I think that in decolonizing justice, the law actually is very little to do with that. And that lawyers, who I think are really constantly being indoctrinated to believe that the law is the best and only tool, really need to step back and create more space for other kinds of conversations, right? It's like you know, how can we do this differently? I think of the kind of Aristotle quote of like, if all you have is a hammer, it's all a nail. And so how do we make sure that we're not kind of rendering the hammer? I think the legal empowerment conversation is really a good kind of kind of bridge to the kind of radical reimagining conversation, because I often think organizers often say that it's their job to work themselves out of a job, that actually if you're a good organizer, what it is that you're building and fighting for hopefully won't still be a problem in 10 years because you brought more folks in, you've changed the terrain. I think the same is true for lawyers, that if we are good transformative radical lawyers, there shouldn't be lawyers in 20 years or a generation, that we know that the law and the kind of legal profession has always been meant to gatekeep, that part of the violence of the law is its exclusivity of who is allowed to operate inside of it. It is, however, not the only violence of the law. And so I think I've been really moved by legal empowerment work because I think it's a means to an end and not an end. I think if we mistake it for the end, it becomes dangerous. But the reality is that the more that we engage folks in power making, in understanding, I think part of at least what drew me to the law was this sense of total powerlessness inside of legal forms that were literally impacting the lives of people that I loved. And so I wanted to enter into the conversation and language of power. And what I found was that knowing the law doesn't actually give you that power, that you're still playing by someone else's rules. But I think the question of how do we use legal empowerment to start to shift power, but ultimately, I think the gatekeeping function of the legal systems and of lawyers and legal workers is really problematic. And so how do we think of legal empowerment as a means to an end of decolonization that has to inherently decenter the law in that project?
Marbre, and building on that and building on what Natasha and Mina were also saying, I think that the reflection of we do this work so that our work is not necessary one day, the idea that we are working towards sustainability and never perpetuity, it's also a challenge to the work that we do, because we know that law colonizes, law dispossesses, law kills people. It kills Black lives, it kills women's, it kills Latinos, it kills people who are living in places where they don't get disaster assistance, or they are colonized by austerity and in many other ways. And I'm thinking also here about the role, as Marbre was saying, of us as lawyers, as legal workers, to also gain space or hold space so that people can build power. And talking about that, and also facing the fact that we are all in the end lawyers, what is our role? How do we right size ourselves against or in front or in relationship to to social movements or to justice movements, considering that before becoming lawyers, we were activists, we were mothers, we were daughters, we were people fighting because we thought this was fundamentally flawed, fundamentally broken. What is our role? Mina, Natasha, Marbre, anyone can please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start quickly. I think it's a lot of what Marbre was just talking about. Just like demystifying the law. So much of the law, when you think about who it has been written by, who it's been practiced by, who upholds it, who benefits and is privileged by it, is, you know, reflective of the same kind of power structures in society. And so it really requires an exaggerated sense of self-importance that means that other people need to have us and to depend on us so that they, you know, that when we charge them, when we tell them what they should or should not be doing, when we have to justify the outcomes of any legal process, that it's seen as legitimate. And as a result, I'm sure all of us on this call at some point have been shown great deference and respect by our communities and by those who feel that they can't make decisions without lawyers in the room, or who feel supported or defended or feel that they need that. And that is by design, the sense of the lack of empowerment to be able to think radically, one, without having to think of the legal consequences, because it's always there as a background punitive measure to stop people from thinking radically about the kinds of changes that they actually need and to act upon them. And then we're there to police that, to make sure that in fact people do stay within the legal boundaries. And so it's really powerful for lawyers to demystify what the law is. And the most common way I think that we do, or the most accessible way that's been also somewhat purified, is like our Know Your Rights trainings and stuff. But even that really needs to be rethought about, where we're not just imparting knowledge, we are relinquishing power in the process and serving as a support, but letting people feel that they have agency and can make decisions about what it is that they need, that they know that better than anyone, and without having to constantly channel them into the very narrow lanes of what is legal. Because that limits then struggle. I mean, it limits then the demands of what's possible. And so I think that's a really kind of very tangible, concrete place for us to start, is to think about and really be active in minimizing our significance and importance in society and struggle in all places, and creating general ways, the way that Ayuda Legal does in Puerto Rico, of democratizing legal knowledge and skills.
Yeah, I would, oh, Mina, you want to go? I would just agree. When you ask kind of what our role is, what came to my mind is like, we're comrades. Like, I have a very specific set of tools that I developed through a lot of law school debt, quite frankly, that is applicable in a very narrow space and kind of moment. But actually the way that I build relationships inside of movement is as a movement actor, as an organizer, as a comrade, as somebody who has deep, authentic relationships, who shows up as my full, flawed self in any given moment. And so I think really de-emphasizing transactional relationships. Lawyers are taught to kind of live inside this like very odd ball of ethics where you're not supposed to get too involved with any quote unquote client. And what that creates is really kind of power hierarchies. And so I show up to movement as somebody who cares deeply for what it is that we're marching for, and not just as like a kind of, like an observer of things, or as a voice that can be objective, that I see myself as inherently not objective. I'm part of a movement, and I'm using my tools to try and build power in that movement. But I show up as a friend, as a comrade. I show up not just professionally, but personally. I build authentic relationships. I think that matters, that if we are fighting alongside movements, we cannot be objective observers of those movements. And that does violence very often. I also will say, I think it's important to show up as a listener, even as somebody who might come from the spaces that you now go back to. When you finish law school, you come back with some privilege. And I think what was said about, like, I found that I had a skill of shutting conversations down as a lawyer. That if I said, I don't think that's possible, all of a sudden everyone's like, okay, it's not possible, let's move on. And it's like, no, my God, I didn't mean to do that. And I, as like just a Black girl 10 years ago, that wouldn't have shut it down. But because of being a lawyer, because of those qualifications, people like endow in me more authority. And so I think it also is coming to the space as a comrade, but checking your privilege, acknowledging no matter where you might come from, that the law and legal degrees, because of the way our society is structured, gives us more power. And that law school indoctrinates you into, I think, a lack of boldness. And so both checking yourself for that and being sure that you're not closing down possibilities in space, and then using the tools you've acquired very narrowly to answer the set of problems that it can address, and not overestimating where the law is useful, I think, is part of the role of lawyers.
Definitely.
I think I like take elements from both. I mean, I definitely, like, in my work have always seen myself as a comrade and an activist, but also seeing like understanding that the law is a lever of power, and a very powerful lever of power that sort of opens up a range of tactics that can help advance movement objectives. I sort of feel like my role is to say, if this is the strategic objective of a campaign, how might we use the law or different kinds of legal tactics to help advance us towards that objective? So if, for example, we need time, and there is a piece of litigation that can be filed, or like some type of city commission hearing that we can agitate for, that will help us create a platform for demands to be heard, then then it's like, how can I use like sort of whatever understanding I might have of the processes to both educate the community, so that hopefully I don't need to be around for the community to just go ahead and do it, but also second, to actually try to agitate and open up new channels of new tactics and new ways of accessing power, new ways of accessing people who have gatekept power, new ways of occupying spaces of power, like the UN, like city commissions, like Congress, and really like agitate in all spaces necessary, that like agitate for the democratic space for our people to like actually like make the demands and say the things that they need to say. And I mean, Marbre is brilliant at this. I mean, everybody I think here is brilliant at also then taking the language of the law and like writing our demands in this language, right? And being able to show that actually it's not like the law must stay in its most oppressive form. There are other ways of writing the law in ways that see like our full humanity. I mean, we can talk about, there are many structural problems with the institutions, and obviously I think more structural change and transformation does need to happen. But I think even just that process of being able to imagine what our demands look like in policy helps open up our imaginations about what like a decolonized future could look like.
And Mina, now that you're talking about advocacy and also other tools beyond like specifically law, someone is asking us about how does this look like using other tools like movement, organizing, direct actions, electoral politics, even art. And also, what is the role of legal workers, of paralegal, community paralegals in this process? Do you think it's similar to the one of the attorneys, or is it different, and how? I don't know if Mina, you want to start with this and then.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, when I think about new kinds of tactics, I think it's like, sort of co-creating a path with the organizers that we're working with. So like, something that when I was at Community Justice Project that we used was, we did use poetry. We used things like almost like these like salon, like forum spaces to have conversations with a broader cross section of people, so that like, rather than the conversation always being like, commissioner sitting on the dais listening to my demand, from like this like sort of positional and even like physical like space of top down, like how do you actually engineer spaces where people can more directly talk to folks and tell their stories, and really help people understand from a very deep place like the stories that animate the demands that are being made in more formal policy spaces. So that's one thing, and which is like kind of like the deeper like work of like cultural change, so to like almost like till the soil, so that the community is ready to hear the demands that people are making. And then art, I think, is an interesting tool, because I think that it hits people in a different way. Like when we perhaps if we're acting in an advocate role or in court or whatever it is, like the words that we use they don't touch people in the same way as like a piece of poetry or a piece of music or a theater piece would. And so it's like, how do you actually like undermine the dominant ideas of what justice are, and like what the basic assumptions that are pushing forward this society that we're currently living in, by showing different kinds of future through artistic pieces, so that's like that part of it. And I think you asked another question that I forgot what it was. What was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
The other part of the question was about community paralegals and their role also.
Oh yes. I mean, I think that we had said it earlier. I think that the lawyer should be like demystified. The role should not be so like kind of held up to the standard that other people can't attain. I think legal workers, people who are members of the community, who are able to translate what's happening in these systems are absolutely imperative. I think that that the lawyer's job should be to completely to break down that gate and to really take away that separation that currently exists between lawyer and legal worker and community. It's like, how do we reconceptualize it, not as one person having like a higher or more important set of skills, but saying like, as an ecosystem, how do we work together towards the same goals and towards the same strategic objectives.
And one of the things that you all have been talking about in this space is not only about the diverse strategies, but also the diverse opponents when we are fighting against a power to build power. How are we fighting against the institutionalization of rights and of law? When we're fighting for self-determination, there's also a lingering question, and I want to pass this to Marbre, about what's the expectation of the work that we do, and also how do we address exhaustion? How do we address that feeling that we have, that we know deep inside that we are not going to see systemic justice in our lifetime, but we work as if it was possible for tomorrow or for today at 5 p.m. How do we deal with that in our work as movement lawyers, as lawyers?
It's such a good question. I think it's a really good bridge from the last question too, because I think that the reality is that we are not going to win, which is the expectation. Like, I think we have to believe that, like, we're going to open more space. We're going to bring more folks into this fight. We're going to, like, leave for our nieces and our nephews and our children and for the next generation a better, more possible space where they can dream bigger. And not that we finish the fight, but that we will have given them more space, more terrain, and more tools for which to fight it. And so I think that has to be the expectation. Otherwise, to me at least, this work feels too daunting. But I think that the same kind of answer that Mina gave around, like, the way that you win is that you build a team, that this is not, that no single legal battle, no single legal win, no single law change will actually transform these systems, that I think the first question got at, that it requires a complete transformation of so many systems, that you can't just have one skill set that's doing that work. You have to have artists and cultural workers and organizers, and like all of that is so necessary. I think in the same way, for us to maintain our health, we have to be in deep relationship with a lot of people, that nobody can do this by themselves, and that it is in fact through all of those different ways that we get replenished. And so I think often about, like, what is a community of people who you bring together, who hold you, who allow you to tap out when you have to, who allow you to create boundaries. But I think for me, part of that has been that the relationships that I think give me hope we win also give me space, and also give me life, and give me, like, comfort when things feel too difficult. And so I think being in this in a really personal, intimate way really does matter, that it's through those relationships that we get fed. The other thing that I think I'll say about kind of resilience is that, at least I find a lot of solace in kind of ancestry or joy, and that for so long, all people, my people, Black people, brown people, all of our people in different ways have made songs out of a tragedy, have found ways to dance. And I don't say that to underestimate or to downplay the level of violence and oppression that we face, but to say that, like, I feel that in my bones. Like, I feel in my bones a deep sense of spirituality and joy that I think part of the mission of colonization has been to destroy and to dismantle. And so I take great, great pride, and I see it as a political mandate, that I remind myself, and that I find kind of the ways in which those that came before me carved out spaces of joy, spaces of worship, spaces of culture, spaces of acknowledging our ancestors and what they gave us in really deep ways. And so I think that, that not only is it an exercise of resilience, but it's also a political exercise to remind ourselves of all of the ways that they were not able to crush the spirits and the cultural practices of our people. And how do we bring that in to everything that we do, whether it's through how we chant, how we dance, how we find joy, where we gather, right? Like, I think that those are really important. And then we're in deep relationship. The last thing I'll say is, I think that the other part about, and I say self-care very carefully, I think it can also get weaponized, but the other part about taking care of yourself is that it's deeply anti-capitalist. That so much of what we're taught is about how much you produce and how that ties into your wealth. But in fact, a lively, active, agile movement does not, I think, judge itself based on its production in the same kind of way. And so how do we actually engage in personal practices that are anti-capitalist, that will allow us to think about all contributions outside of kind of monetized ways, which I think is also really important.
Natasha, you, the person who dances.
I mean, I was like, Marbre just like took the words right out of my mouth. I always, I talk about this, I often talk about how we center joy as a response to burnout, to the question around burnout, right? Because it's, capitalism, the same way that US exceptionalism infuses all of our movements. And sometimes we think that the best activists have to be the busiest ones, have to be the ones that sacrifice the most, that the ones are always out there. And that's a disturbing notion of what it is that we're trying to achieve here, which is to reverse that sense of how much we produce is where our worth is derived from. And then having to convince other people that we're constantly busy in this work towards justice in order for them to also kind of validate our sense of worth. And that is inevitably going to lead to burnout. And burnout, as we all know, because we've worked with people who've been doing this way too long than they should, even if their heart is in it. And people who are burnt out burn others, right? And they don't know how to not, that it actually, I think, works against what we're trying to do, which is seek to transform systems. And if you're burnt out, you're just perpetuating them ultimately. And interrupting that with joy is so contrary to the legal system and to what lawyers do. I mean, there's a reason why lawyers have the highest rates of suicide, of depression, of alcoholism, drug use of most professions, because what we do is the engine of capitalism and empire and colonialism, right? It's by design. And so of course it's going to eat us, right? It's not, we think that, we get to control it and and we build careers off of this and prestige and fame, but it's actually devouring us. And so when we interrupt that and think about how we center joy, the way that if you go to a legal conference in Puerto Rico, for example, you'll have a salsa band playing every day and people dance. I mean, thinking of how we infuse, to Marbre's point, our own cultural practices and places and senses that give us joy into professional spaces, but also in our own lives, not apologizing for it, understanding it as an integral part to struggle, because ultimately the purpose of struggle is to not struggle, not to have to struggle. And so when we center those moments and times, it really, I think, also gives permission for others to do the same, and ultimately helps transform the very spaces that we're trying to, and allows us to think and act and behave in ways that run so counter to what we've been told is professional, is lawyerly, is whatever it is that we know has actually nothing to do with our community practices or ancestral practices, or what is gonna help bring us, closer to liberation. And so to be really intentional and unapologetic about it, I think is in and itself a somewhat radical act. And to introduce it as much as possible so that it becomes normalized, and not just taking our lead from activists and organizers that do that well, but for lawyers that insist upon it, is also, I think, pretty, can be pretty revolutionary for our space.
Natasha, we have a 15-minute mark to wrap up this discussion. Probably we're going to extend it by 5 minutes just because we are who we are. But I wanted to speak a little bit about principles. And this is something that people have been writing on the Q&A about faith, about healing, about nurturance, about also you have been talking a lot about vulnerability. And sometimes we know about the values of our work, about the principle of our work, because something makes us angry at that moment, or something makes us cry, or something makes us feel extremely joyful, or extremely grateful, or extremely full of possibilities. And I wanted to talk about principles. Right now, where you are at this moment, Marbre, Mina, Natasha, everyone that is listening to this conversation, what is the principle that's moving your work? What is the main principle today at this moment that's making you grounded in justice work? And why does that makes you feel like a just world is possible? Just the first principle that comes into your mind, why, and what is that the relationship between that principle and a just world? So I don't know.
You want to kick us off, Ariadna? What is the word for you?
I'm grateful. I'm grateful. Every time that I start any kind of conversation, I always say I'm grateful to be here. I'm a survivor, and I'm a fighter, and I realize that. So I'm grateful. A while ago, like I almost cried when Marbre said, and that's it for me today. We are comrades. Somos compañeros. We are not alone anymore, and that's a realization that I'm always grateful for. Marbre.
I love that. Thank you for that. What popped in my head was dignity, that I believe in the inherent dignity of people of this planet. I believe that all systems should reflect that. And that for so long, they have not. They've disrespected basic dignity of kind of relationships of people. And so I fight for an abolitionist objective. I fight for the end of systems that tear us down, that destroy us, that kill us. I fight for the end of colonialism, which is based on the assumption of people's lack of dignity. And so that's what comes into my mind, is that is like the kind of guiding. And love, I think that so much of the work that I do is really is grounded in a sense of profound love for my people, for my ancestors, for this earth that gives us so much. And so what does that love require of us and of me, as a constant question I ask myself. And I'll pass it to Mina if we're just passing.
Yes, all of that. And I think the first word that came to my mind is, well, the first word that came was freedom, but also solidarity, because we're not going to be free if we don't see the way that our own struggles are bound up with others. And I think, for a very long time, as someone who neither feels, from this country nor from the country that my parents come from, I feel like I've only been able to really feel fully myself when I'm able to understand and fight for the struggles and fight alongside people that are clamoring for freedom and for justice. And for me, it's I think there's no way that I'm going to understand all of the things that each person has been through. There's, I only have my lived experience and what has been passed down from my parents and my ancestors, but I don't have to have experienced that for me to fight with you. Somos compañeros. Solidarity. Natasha.
Somos compañeros. The first word that also popped up in my mind was freedom. But I don't think of it just as the formal notions of freedom or the formalism that goes with it, the systems that allow us, or the laws that get passed that recognize it. It's really also about all the individual ways that we allow ourselves to be free from expectations, from traumas, from feel that we have to continuously perpetuate these cycles that are harmful to us, all of the ways that we have individual and collective freedoms that have been taken from us, and reclaiming those, and some in very subtle ways. And, while the law is obviously about, formalism and the formalization of freedom, the public recognition of what dignity looks like and who gets access to it and whose humanity gets uplifted. And ultimately, though, what we're in this for is not just for that public recognition. It's for us to for us to feel free, whether you acknowledge my right to be so or not. And that's what I've learned so much from the communities that I've got to be and struggle with, right? They aren't waiting for anyone to tell them that they're free or to act like it. They, inherently know it already. They access it. They insist upon it for others as well, not just for themselves. I mean, really deeply understanding that principle that of what collective liberation is, that in order for one of us to be, all of us to be free, or one of us to be free, all of us have to be free. So to me, I feel like that kind of combined really with Marbre's, talking about the notion of dignity and how we all access it is probably what drives me the most.
Thank you. Thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. I wanted to end up by asking, how does winning looks like? If we are able to get, and we are going to up to work or to build the world that we want, that we need, that we envision, that we intention, that we dream of. Because as you said at the beginning, at the end, decolonizing justice is about self-determination, which is not only about the needs, it's also about the wants. It's also about that question of the future that has been taken from us because of colonization, because of racism, because of patriarchy, because the way that law, its engines, its institutions destroy us. And I wanted to think a little bit about how does it looks like when we take it back, when we reclaim it, or when we throw it away and build something else. How does it look like? And please, when you answer, talk a little bit about the work, the organization that you're working on. Because when we talk about what do we need, we always talk about like very abstract things, solidarity, love, but we also need resources. We also need visibility. We also need amplifying. And part of this work is also asking what we need to continue doing it. So very, very briefly, how does winning looks like and what do we need to get there? Marbre.
I was ready. I could like sense it. When you asked this question in the email, I was like trying to think about it last night. And I realized, so I mean, I think winning looks like, I think all of us know, although I didn't believe this when I was 20, now that I'm in my mid 30s, I'm convinced that this is not a generational fight, that we don't win this. We don't win the transition of these systems. It took hundreds of years to build them. It would take a while to dismantle them in our lifetimes. And I think that like, it's just now, and I have a 6-month-year-old daughter, that I'm like actually making peace with that reality of like the impatience of my youth, which was really, I think, like, was inspirational. It got me moving. Has I don't think subsided for real acceptance. Like, oh, I'm building a better terrain to fight on for the next generation. But with all that said, so I think winning is having more folks in the fight. I think winning is more possibility. But one thing I'll say is this summer, so I was on maternity leave when like everything popped off, which is very hard for somebody who is often a workaholic. But I have a vivid memory of, it was, I think my daughter was born a week after George Floyd was killed. And so she was about a month old, and we were taking a walk in my neighborhood in Fort Greene. And there have been marches every single night. And we were walking on the street, and on every single wall, it said #defund the police. And I just like broke down sobbing because I had been part of a fight for now over 6 years that it had involved countless people in the streets. And we had been demanding like the end of body cameras, really small tweaks at the edges of this system. And what I realized was that although I think the last time we kind of made headline news was 5 years ago after the killing of Mike Brown, that there had been 5 years of deep, profound work of relationship building, of demand formation, of thinking about the political education of our people. And as a result, 5 years later, nobody was asking for body cameras. We were asking for a defunding of these systems. And that to me is a win. And then I can be on maternity leave with my baby and have that work continue because we've built up literally, like people have been trained into this movement. and they're in the streets, and I get a second with my child, to me was a total win. And not only have we changed the narrative, but more folks are in the fight. And so I think winning right now looks like the evolution of our demands. It looks like more folks inside of this fight in relationship together.
Mina.
Yes to the slow roll of progress. I mean, when I think about decolonizing the law, I think about eliminating the institutions of colonialism, no police, no prisons, no military. But, as Marbre said, that is a goal that perhaps we may not see in our lifetime, but we can still work towards that. And I think with the work of the Movement Law Lab, I think something that we're really trying to do is grow the field. And this kind of goes to that question of sustainability as well, because, our little crew of people are not going to achieve this decolonization of the system on our own. So it's absolutely necessary to enlist more people into this fight, and that this conversation that we're having can't be a marginal one. Decolonizing the law involves getting broad swaths of those that are complicit in this system or working within the system to understand the harm that it is doing, and then commit to doing differently, to operating differently. And so some of the things, this past summer, we experimented with a course called Build Power, Fight Power. And that was, it to us, I think, the amount of interest in that kind of a course was indicative of, how many people are actually really wanting to practice differently and have a critical lens of the way that our legal system is operating. But the other side of our work, which is on the global level, I think is really important, especially for these questions of solidarity, and given the fact that so many of the crises that we're facing are global in nature. And no amount of working within the US is going to solve it elsewhere. We have to, for our collective liberation, as we were talking earlier, connect with, support, and build up movement lawyers or people who are in movements all around the world. And so I think that, the hope is that by being more connected and really understanding the kinds of political and the historical dimensions of justice fights around the world, like we can come to a better understanding of what the sort of future structure should look like and what a decolonized future would look like.
There's not much to add. I'll just say what comes to my mind when I think of winning. The first thing that popped in my mind, especially when you asked us to kind of personalize it, to bring it home, was, being able to walk the streets without being afraid of violence, lifting of sanctions regimes on countries I love, and austerity measures, and stopping the privatization of public services, and all the things that feel very intimate and close to me. But I also thought the really uncomfortable spaces and uncomfortable conversations that we're having, to me, means that we are closer to winning, because and I know that it feels that for many people, particularly after this electoral cycle, that there were huge losses and stuff. And yet, because what we know about oppression is that it requires our complicity, active or through silence, and to continue to, in silence, reap the benefits of it, because it's uncomfortable to challenge the privilege that comes along with it. And so the fact that there's so many people who are uncomfortable right now, to me, signals that there's a ripeness for what could be a really transformative moment. And it doesn't mean it's pretty and nice and it's going to be like everyone comes and understands what dignity looks like or what justice looks like. I don't think, as Marbre says, that will even happen in our generation or my lifetime, maybe. But it signals to me a shift and the possibility for us to be able to capture on this, to sit with people in the discomfort, because communities of color, and particularly Black people, have had centuries of discomfort, and to use that as a really, as a catapult into something else that may have yet to be defined, to me feels like part of what winning can look like. And and maybe that's because I want to center joy, talking about, thinking about this from a space of joyfulness and optimism. But I also think that there's, every time we're made uncomfortable, that it means that we're on the cusp of a transformative moment. And so hopefully, the work that we're all engaged in, not just in the profession, but all of us are engaged in, are leading to what that, collective transformation can look like.
And since time betrays us, I think that what I have to say is that everything continues to be possible. That line, Frank O'Hara's line, that is moving a lot of us in these last few days, weeks, and years. So we are here at the end of the world, at the end of 2020, and still talking about nurturing, about building, about sustaining. And I think that's, as Natasha was saying, a sign that we are winning. We are walking towards that point. As usual, I wanted to say thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Marbre. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Liz, Matthew, Nicole, Jenny, for holding this space. Thank you, Cooperativa Brújulas, for teaching us about language justice and helping this reach a lot of more people. Millo, Bruje, thank you for your love. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your solidarity. And so, Liz, back to you.
Gracias a ti, Ariadna.
Gracias.
Well, thank you so much, Mina, Natasha, and Marbre, and Ariadna. We are so grateful for the time, visions, joy, and optimism you've brought to this conversation and this convening, and Ariadna for facilitating this incredible conversation and your support in designing this entire week-long gathering. For the 100+ of you who joined us today, if you're not familiar with the work of these 4 amazing women and their organizations, please do take the time to learn more about it and the spaces they're creating in the US and beyond for these discussions and these visions. And as Mina said at the end, we need to connect our conversations here and in the US with what is happening globally. And so we will be reconvening in an hour to do exactly that, with our final closing session on global perspectives on advancing community-centered justice. So we hope all of you will rejoin us then, and thank you again to our incredible panel today.